Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Good morning, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin and this is Nikos RPG. We are, of course, today as Game Master's Guide, getting on our soapbox a bit, and we are going to be talking about a particular peccadillo that I have about roleplay, and one of the greatest challenges that we can face in terms of bringing the story of a role-playing game to being is dealing with the very real possibility of a persona or more than one character, if you will, in a game to meet their demise in the story. And we're going to be talking today about how that has evolved over time, how the process went from the origins of the game and the sheer mechanics of it to a much different animal that we are engaged with now. And I think you'll be kind of surprised with my take on this. With 50 years of experience doing it, I've had so many different ways that players have interacted with the game system over time, and as I've evolved as a storyteller, it has become very challenging and interesting to see how people engage with this portion of the game, which is should be, well, we'll get into it. Just leave it at that for now. Here, let's get started. Before we do that, make sure you hit all the buttons to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience. Thank you for being here, and I hope to have a great conversation with you in the comments concerning this topic, as I try to every time. Alrighty, so we are going to talk today about the evolution of investment. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take these off because they are bugging the crap out of me. Alrighty, so the evolution of investment, that's a kind of a funny way of saying it, but the reality is that players who create a character for a role-playing game tend to put some time into that process and invest, if you will, in that character episode over episode. And there was a change up, I guess, somewhere along the line, and I'll talk about that and address the actual transition as we go. But the idea here is that we're going to be talking about how people engage with the arguably one of the darkest parts of the role-playing game, and that is the demise of the character, the end of a storyline within that framework, and how players interacted and dealt with it over time, and how that has itself changed. We all start off with a rather childlike perception of mortality. We've played, in the streets and playing the pew pew games and dealing with the idea of whether it be looking at it as cops and robbers or wartime experiences or dare I say in America, cowboys and Indians. The concept of playing with the idea that we see in television and movies, the concept of the character, classic character, being wounded, being injured, eventually having to be retired from the story. And a childlike perception of it is, okay, you're dead, now get back up, let's continue playing, because we understand that the reality of the very process of demise is itself something that kids don't want to think about. They just know that in the movies, a guy gets, shot in one movie, and in the next episode he's back and up and running again. So the idea of the death of identity is not even associated with it. They're not considering with what they're, of course, dying. They're talking about the character that they're playing reaches its termination. And this idea, this childlike perception of mortality, is something that is, I think, in some ways extremely healthy, because it gets us past the vast pit of despair that any demise actually results in reality. So it's much better to take it on as a fictional element. As a matter of fact, one of the big challenges when I was a child was there was a movement that was started to get rid of the violence in television and in particular in cartoons, and so they fundamentally outlawed for a period of time, not really outlawed, but they downplayed the kinds of cartoons that I was raised up on, where ridiculous deaths were occurring all the time. The idea of Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny kind of Looney Tunes violence, the idea of hitting somebody with a hammer or dropping an anvil on their head. It was never emulatory. It wasn't set up so that you would even think about doing it, and yet the people who were in the know of the intelligentsia of the time really promoted the removal of those in some way, thinking that would improve the amount of reduce the amount of violence in the average person's life by taking away the cartoon form of it. To me, that seems almost counterintuitive, because when you take it out of the realm of imagination, the only place a person's left to go with it is reality. If you don't see the ludicrousness of it in the cartoons. I mean, take just example of poor Wile E. Coyote. He is inevitably blown up, lacerated, thrown off a cliff, plummets to his death, is in a room with a bomb. Whatever, they're all ludicrous, and yet they don't show the actual termination, because he's a cartoon character. He's cellulose. He's a piece of paper. There's nothing behind it. And so the idea of that level of mortality, when Dungeons and Dragons and the other role-playing games that came out 50 years ago started up, they were of that same process. Now, there was a challenge, because in creating a character, it took a considerable amount of time to invest into the paper creation of it. So you ostensibly didn't want your character to die week over week, but the idea was that if it did, you just rolled up a new character and kept going, started a new part of the story. On the other hand, storytellers tend to want to tell a story that's long, and for that to occur, the characters need to be perpetual, or at least kept week over week over week for the arc of the story, so that the continuity is there. So the long campaign, although it was sort of dangerous from the standpoint of the player's investiture became greater and greater, the desire of the storyteller was to have a grand arc, a long tail story that players could appreciate, because they would understand the world, get a better, more full experience with the game itself. And I call it the dangerous long campaign, because the challenge with a longer campaign is that your player's investment becomes greater and greater, to the point where they start to feel a sense of belonging and existence in a fictional setting, instead of just only in the reality world and playing the game just for the fun of playing. So the game master then starts to create this idea of the player's characters in his story, fundamentally the way we think of pets, and that is to say, you want to ensure they are provided welfare-wise. You want to make sure that they have a good experience playing and become part of the story by their very existence. That leads, therefore, to both the player and the character investing in the story and in those particular characters. And there became an increasing difficulty for players to deal with the elimination of their characters. Now, when you were looking at the game purely as a mechanical tool, as we were talking about in the early days, the childlike aspect, you didn't really anticipate any allegiance to that character. In other words, okay, you're playing a bard, and the bard has gotten a situation. The bard is now removed from the game. okay, I'm going to roll up a new character and bring it in, and the game master is going to usher them into the story, and now they're going to replace the previous character. And that rolling mentality of characters meant that many players would have 8 or 10 or 12 different characters and would play whichever one would suit the story. As you start to develop the long tail, the players are now investing more time in an individual character to the point where it starts to gain an affinity, a relationship. It was no longer just a piece of paper and a character, but you were actually that person week over week, and therefore you became invested in the story, and the two were complementary. But that led to the real difficulties of the game. And that occurred when we had the investment reversal. Dungeons and Dragons, as originally designed, was focused on the game master's story and the players interacting in it as living playing pieces or whatever. And as time went by, the players' investment would become higher and higher to the point where the publishers focused their product instead of being designed to promote to the storyteller. Now it became a matter of promoting to the player, and that player priority changes their perspective. They now don't even really consider the death of their character as being a possibility. They have begun to see the storyteller's story as being a framework from which they can suspend their character's existence, like a framework, a wireframe, if you will, like this one, that they can build their story upon, facet by facet. And as they create those different facets and establish that reality, now they become the centerpiece for the very story itself. And so that the game master now has to consider how he can keep them alive. And there's a particular element I'm going to talk about here in a minute that actually I think kind of explains this in the easiest way possible. But this need for the characters to stay alive session after session and to be part of the story in a very integral way and everything was a result of those who played became invested, and those that had never heard of role-play games simply didn't get involved because that was weird. It was odd to hear people speaking of themselves in the third person, or to speak of doing things that patently obvious that they could not have done themselves. So it was kind of bifurcating. It kind of divided us culturally one from another. This led, of course, to therefore the confusion about the value of loss. What it is that we lose when a character dies. And when you have no investment in it whatsoever, when it's, if you're playing a video game and your persona dies in the game, yeah, you may have lost a few hours of your life, so to speak, investing in that persona, but you just hit the restart button and now you start all over and you progress. And as a matter of fact, with the advent of the save button, the idea that death even exists falls away. And so the idea of loss within the game only happens by accident instead of by intention. And so there is no longer a feeling of loss when the character is eliminated, except in roleplay games. And that has everything to do with the fact that because of the long tail story that the game master started with and the extended investment of the players in that persona, the very concept of that persona being eliminated becomes unconscionable. It becomes literally inconceivable. It's not something that a person can directly and easily accept, and instead becomes something that causes them pain. And that has to do everything with the confusion of the value of loss. And this is kind of the point I was getting to earlier. So in World War II, in the time frame between the 40s and the 50s, fully 50% of Americans either knew somebody who was in the war or was directly involved in the war effort themselves. That close proximity to the very concept of death made things very serious, made it more difficult to deal with things other than in an abstract way, and that for that main reason, a lot of the emulation of gameplay was only the basic analysis on the third party side of what might have happened in those situations as an abstract. It was not a visceral thing. People were not trying to play out warfare, they'd seen it or they knew of it. You go 20 years down the road, 60s and 70s, Vietnam and Korea, and it's down to 1 in 15,000 people. I'm sorry, 1 in 150 people that either were in the war or knew somebody in the war. As the conflicts became smaller, more isolated, and needed fewer actual military personnel, this number keeps shrinking. When you get to the concept of Desert Storm, you're looking at 1 in 15,000. I mean, I've got my numbers wrong. I have to get my grid out and look at it again. But by the time you get to modern times, it's 1 in 150,000. And that means that a vast majority of human beings have never had anything to do with the actual catastrophe and devastation of loss. Yes, there are accidents that happen, and there are a certain number of people that will have this as part of their lives. But generally speaking, most people don't deal with loss except for more naturally things like more natural things like disease and that kind of thing, where old age and these kind of things that allow for people to have more time to process and to see this loss as something that is outside of themselves and not something they ever actually have to deal with. Unfortunately, as you come to the present, you've got people who have never suffered a loss. They're closing in on 500,000 people. One in 500,000 have actually had to deal with a military loss. And as former military myself, and my son is in the military, and he had to deal with a lot more direct things, having been injured during warfare. The number of people who understand what it is to lose something has fallen away, such that the players that even play role-play games today are playing in generally political dramatic games, and very few of them actually have, if they are looking at it in terms of loss, they're looking at it from the standpoint of the analytics of a war gamer or a much more video game like opportunity, where they're literally trying to win the game by maximizing or optimizing their characters' capabilities. And this actually lends itself to one or two thoughts. One thought is, well, don't play role-play games because it puts you in a place where you have to consider these losses, and let's shy away from that because our culture is doing that. But my argument is that actually play more times, have more characters in their existence in violence, only so that we can keep the concept of what it is to lose as something personal and learn to deal with it. The more times it happens, the more you become acclimated to it. Now in our culture, it says, no, we don't have to feel pain anymore. The world is a safer, cleaner, happier place. But if we do not hold on to what those losses mean, then we become disconnected, distant from it, and tend to ignore it when it does happen, or try to pretend that it's somebody else's problem. And these are dangerous philosophies to take. So, as a game master with 5 decades of experience, my best recommendation is play more role-play games, more types of role-play games, more different kinds of interactions, so that your experience as a person, if not improved directly, can at least be indirectly modified by your perception of the world that you're in by playing and living in other worlds. Alrighty, I think that's going to be it for today. I want to thank you for being here today. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. And the entirety of the suite is now available. The link down below, I'll put it in the comment section as well. But you can actually purchase now all of the Nikos suite. So that is the basic master book and 6 genre books that covers everything from World War I and mysticism, Gothic and cosmic horror, all the way to postmodern, post-apocalyptic, and modern drama. So much more for you about that. Check out nikosbook.myshopify.com down below. All right. Have a great day.